Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2. Today I'm going to be showing you guys the build that I've been having success with on my Sorcerer that I've used pretty much all the way up to level 100, and I've been optimizing a bit. This is a hybrid build between using Firewall and Meteor without really sacrificing damage for either of the skills so that both of them do a crazy amount of damage. The best part about this build is that it's super easy to transition into from just using pure Firewall to swapping over to kind of a hybrid setup once you get the unique helmet for Meteor. This build also has an incredibly low gear requirement and will just work right off the rip because of a lot of the inherent synergies and strength of Firewall by default, and it will work fantastically for you guys if you're just trying to level up. The biggest downside of a Firewall build is actually the single target damage. I spent a lot of time trying to optimize around this. Unfortunately, the truth is kind of just that this build isn't going to ever have extremely good single target damage, but that's really the only downside, and you're still able to kill bosses way faster than a lot of other people will. You're just not going to be one-shotting the bosses like a barbarian or something. The reason for a hybrid build rather than a full Meteor build is because it is extremely gear dependent to have the build focused all around meteors. I will be posting a full Meteor variation probably tomorrow because I do think that is the better version of the build. Here you can see two boss kills, one with Meteor, one with the Firewall variation. Overall clearing and stuff, I like the pure Meteor version more. It is just way more gear dependent and you need a pretty much perfect character in order to set that up. But this hybrid variation using both skills is just really strong by default and will completely carry you up to level 100 without really needing any gear at all. So pretty much just view this build as a very easy to play version of the build that you can use as a stepping stone build into a full Meteor variation if you're more interested in playing with only meteors pretty much and you just hate Firewall. Today's video is sponsored by Geology. Their products have been an absolute lifesaver for me, mainly their line of aluminum-free deodorants, which I couldn't recommend to you guys more. It's extremely hard to find long-lasting, actually good quality deodorant that is aluminum-free, and aluminum was causing a lot of problems for me personally, so I'd highly recommend you guys at least try these out. But Geology has a ton of different products. They're mainly a very high-quality skincare brand. They offer extremely high-quality products using tons of natural ingredients that are proven to work. With over 7,000 5-star reviews, you can trust you're getting the best stuff out there that is going to work for you. Using the link below, you can take a personalized quiz that will create the perfect routine customized just for you that's super simple to follow and extremely effective. For me, the Dark Circle Eye Cream has been an absolute godsend after spending so many late nights mindlessly grinding, but like I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of their deodorants as well as the Bergamo Body Wash, which both just smell fantastic. For a limited time, you can get a massive 70% off their skincare trial set if you use my link, but you'll also get an additional offer for up to 30% off of any add-ons with your purchase, so make sure to check out the link in the description and fix your degenerate gamer hygiene today. Getting into the build, I quickly want to mention why you'd actually want to play a hybrid version of the build in the first place and what exactly is holding you back from going into a full Meteor version of the build. Most people aren't going to be able to get the Meteor unique until around level 80 or so, depending on your luck. And before you get the Meteor unique, incorporating Meteor into your build is not really going to help you that much because this is going to significantly increase the damage output of the Meteor. Prior to getting this unique, most people are going to be playing a pure Firewall build. Firewall is incredibly strong by default because it just has a very high damage modifier. It covers a very large range, and when you pair it with the Firewall enchant, it is going to just proc firewalls like crazy. It's incredibly good, probably one of the best skills for AoE. It's a very low mana cost, the lucky hit is very good on it, and the second that you get X falls, it kind of just starts popping off like crazy. The biggest problem with Firewall though is your single target damage. Until you get X falls, your single target damage is going to feel pretty weak, and even once you do get X falls, you're kind of relying on this, and your boss kills are going to be a bit slow. Once you have the build like very well set up, you can do like pretty respectable boss damage. You know, as you can see in the gameplay here, I'm not like taking 5 minutes to kill the boss like I've seen some people on YouTube with like Bone Spirit or whatever. But you're not a charged barbarian one-shotting the boss, right? So the biggest way to solve the single target damage problem is, at least other than X-Falls, is to just scale your Meteor damage as high as possible. The problem though is if you immediately try to start scaling your Meteor damage, it isn't going to work because Meteor, in order for it to be good, you can see I have a charge cooldown of 3.9 seconds. I only have it this low because I have a Starfall that's a 6.5 second roll, and I have cooldown reduction almost everywhere. If I swap to my other cooldown reduction amulet, it goes down to 3.5 seconds, and once it's a really low cooldown, you can just start spamming the Meteor like crazy, and you don't really have to rely on Firewall for that damage output. But it's really hard to get a low rolled coronet. For a while, I was using an 11-second one, and if I just put on this 8-second one that I was using, you can see it goes up to 4.9 seconds. If it's 4.9 seconds, I use 2 meteors, and then I'd have to AFK for 2 seconds. So it just simply is not feasible to build full into meteor until you get near perfect gear. Another reason it's not great is because if you were to build full into meteor, the way to scale meteor is with a lot of crit chance and crit damage. Elementalist is incredibly good for meteor, and it requires you to be above 100 mana, and the second that you press one firewall, you're below 100 mana, so you're not going to get this crit chance. And also, crit chance doesn't scale firewall, because firewall is a damage over time effect that doesn't scale off of crit damage, other than the Paragon node, and doesn't scale off of crit chance because it can't crit. Another thing that drastically increases Fireball's damage output is the aspect of 3 curses, which is crit damage, and it does 120% crit damage against healthy targets. It also scales very well off of things like Devouring Blaze and Essu's Ferocity, and all of these things are not going to scale your Firewall. So if you immediately try to build full into Meteor, it's not going to work very well for you because you're taking away so much damage from Firewall, and then Meteor is still going to have a long cooldown. So it's much better to use generic damage aspects that are going to improve the damage of both your Firewall and your Meteor until you are able to kind of cross that threshold and go balls deep into Meteor, if that makes sense. The benefit of building both Firewall and Meteor ends up being that your clear speed is kind of insane because the lucky hit chance effect of using both of these is very strong, and because you're not using any like specific legendaries that only scales Meteor, for example, or only scales Firewall, all of these general damage aspects will end up scaling your X-Falls very hard to where you can do like upwards of 3 million damage. Firewall and Meteor happen to just pair very well with each other because of the way that the enchants work, where lucky hits are going to proc extra firewalls, and then those firewalls can lucky hit more firewalls, and every time you lucky hit, you have a chance to spawn a Meteor as well. This kind of creates an infinite chain on AoE, but I don't think this infinite chain is nearly as good as people think that it is, because on AoE, when there's like a lot of targets active, I'll just show you real quick, you'll be spawning a crazy amount of firewalls and meteors, like it's actually insane. But Firewall has never had a problem with AoE. It's always done insanely good AoE damage. As you can see, like X-Falls is blowing up for 3 million. I'm spawning firewalls everywhere. I'm doing 1 million burn damage a tick. Like, Firewall has never once had a problem doing AoE damage. Firewall's problem is doing single target damage, and when you don't have 50 targets to proc lucky hits off of, you're not going to be lucky hitting or getting lucky hit procs. You're not going to be proccing a bunch of meteors and firewalls. I'll show you right here on just one target. I'll be proccing firewalls, but I'm like pretty much never going to proc a meteor. So my boss damage is still heavily reliant on X-Falls, and it's still just not really all that strong. When it comes to the rest of the skills, we're pretty much just using things that complement the build. I mean, if you guys have played Sorc before, you know, Teleport is really good. Damage reduction, movement speed, unstoppable, but you pair it with Raiment, which is incredibly good with this build, just sucking all the mobs together, taking advantage of damage versus crowd controlled, and it just works really well because when things are closer together, that has a very higher chance of like spawning more firewalls, which will then spawn more meteors, and then X-Falls will kind of just proc and blow everything up. Outside of that, Flame Shield is just for the immunity and the unstoppable. Frost Nova is for the freezing them and also just making them vulnerable. And then Ice Blades is for the vulnerable application on single target. It will pretty much guarantee give you 100% vulnerable uptime against bosses, and it also counts towards your Tal Rashas via frost damage. Frost Nova doesn't actually do damage, so you need to use Ice Blades in order to get the damage effect out of Tal Rashas there with ice. And if you just deal damage with Teleport, it counts as a stack for Tal Rashas. So as long as you're just hitting an enemy, which you always will with Raiment, then you're good. When it comes to the skill tree, our basic skill doesn't matter. 1 into Devastation, 3 into Elemental Dominance for damage. Just 1 point into Flame Shield, but you could go into movement speed and mana cost reduction if you prefer. But mana is like literally not a problem with this build at all. Firewall doesn't cost very much, and Sorc has very high inherent mana regen, so it's kind of impossible to run out of mana if you have it set up even remotely properly. Going to Teleport for the damage reduction, I just have 1 extra point for cooldown, but it doesn't really matter. 1 into Elemental Attunement just for a chance to reset a lot of these defensive skills. Then I have Frost Nova with the vulnerable. Max out Glass Cannon. If you feel like you're dying a lot, just take the points out of this, but it's a lot of extra damage. 3 into Precision Magic for extra lucky hit chance, which procs our Firewall and Meteor enchant. Ice Blades with the Enhanced Ice Blades. It's constantly making enemies vulnerable, so it will reduce its cooldown a little bit, which is nice. You can just always have an Ice Blades out to help you with vulnerable uptime. Align the Elements is great for damage reduction. I have 3 points here, but you don't really need to go full into it. You could put 2 of these points into Teleport for cooldown reduction. 3 into Mana Shield is very strong, and Protection is very good for always giving you a barrier, and you're constantly cycling your cooldown, so you have a barrier up all the time. You want to max out Meteor and use Meteor Immobilize. The reason for the Immobilize is we're using the Control Glyph, and we're using Devouring Blaze. Otherwise, you could just use Mage's Meteor if you want them to fall a little bit faster. It's kind of just personal preference there. 3 into Inner Flames for extra damage, and then max out Devouring Blaze to just increase the damage of Meteor. Then we max out Firewall, and we go into Mage's Firewall. I've seen some people take Wizards. Literally never do that ever, please. You don't need mana regen with this build, and Mage's Firewall drastically increases the amount of damage that you're going to do. Without this, the damage is going to be pretty weak on Firewall. At least when you're clearing, because enemies are constantly behind you. Let me go 1 into Fiery Surge and 3 into Endless Pyre for extra burning damage against bosses. I actually took the points out of Align the Elements because I forgot I needed to spec this. And then 3 into Warmth. This is a crazy amount of healing. Highly suggest using this. If you have any mana issues early on at all, just put the points into Fiery Surge and you won't have problems ever again. You could just take the point out of Enhanced Ice Blades, or even out of Elemental Attunement or Teleport if you wanted to spec into Fiery Surge. Then we go into Combustion for additional burning damage, and if you want to start swapping the build over to Meteor slowly, you'd want to swap out to Essu's Ferocity. But again, this crit damage is not going to affect your Firewall damage. It will only affect the Meteor. When it comes to the pet, you have quite a few options. It's kind of up to you. I've realized that using Resource Support kind of isn't necessary because Firewall barely costs mana, but if you really never want to worry about mana ever again, just slap on like Lightning Bolt or even Tempest, and then you can just use Resource Support, and that basically will give you infinite mana. Next to that, you can use Breaking Support for extra vulnerable uptime. I've realized this isn't entirely necessary. Once you get a low enough cooldown on Frost Nova and you have Ice Blades out a lot, that is going to be okay enough for vulnerable. When you're AoE clearing and everything will just die in like a second anyways, you really only need the vulnerable for bosses because that's your only weakness. Breaking Support is not great because the pet is constantly lacking behind you and it's really annoying, but if you just want more redundancy, you just go Breaking Support, Arcing Support so that it hits more enemies, and then Resource so that you get a lot of that mana back. Pair that with Lightning Bolt and it's pretty decent. Next to that, I have Tempest. The reason I like Tempest is because it's a short cooldown. I mix that with Fortify support, so I permanently have Fortify up, and then I have Evernight, which I was lucky enough to get. But if you don't have Evernight, I would recommend going into damage reduction via Safeguard support. And Initiative is nice just so the pet is constantly teleporting to me, because otherwise the pet is literally in Africa all the time, and even with this, it is still in Africa all the time. Once you end up getting Genesis, I would probably just swap off of Lightning Bolt entirely, and I would go into Flash of Adrenaline, which is just a damage increase. It goes up to 20%, but then if you use Genesis, it would go up to a 50% damage increase, which would be really good. And then you compare that with like duration support, so it lasts longer, and then reduce the cooldown, and you'd have 100% uptime on a 50% multiplicative damage increase, which would just be better than a little bit of redundant vulnerable. Fortify is nice because it gives you damage reduction while it's up, but you could also just alternatively use the flat damage reduction thing, and you can use both of these together for quite a lot of damage reduction until you end up getting Evernight. When it comes to your legendaries and uniques, obviously you can't really take advantage of Meteor very well until you get the Starfall Coronet. The biggest thing with this is getting as low of a Meteor cooldown as humanly possible. Once you get one that is below 7 seconds, that's probably the threshold that I would say it's okay to swap to a full Meteor version of the build. Until then, Meteor just has way too long of a cooldown in order to rely on it as your only source of damage output. Raiment is incredibly good for teleport stunning everything and just sucking all the mobs together. It simply will just increase your clear speed, but it drastically nerfs your survivability. If you want more survivability, you could just easily wear a normal chest piece perfectly fine. You don't lose out on all that much damage. Raiment is just helpful. I have Essu's on, but I don't really know if I think this is necessary. It's nice because it has really good stats on it, but the problem with it is that you kind of just feel really slow not having a movement speed legendary, and crit chance is not going to scale your firewall, right? It's only going to scale X-Falls and Meteor, so it is helpful, but it's not a crazy amount of crit chance. Feel free to just use a movement speed legendary boot if you feel like it. For the rest of our uniques, we have Talrashas, which you can get off of Varshan. Talrashas is insane. You get a 45% damage increase from this because we deal damage with lightning with teleport, Ice Blades with frost, and then obviously fire with meteor and firewall, etc. It also comes with cooldown reduction on a ring, which you normally can't get. and it has non-fizz damage, lucky hit chance, which is really strong. And then you also want X-Falls, which you can get off of Duriels. This just does a crazy amount of damage, and it also comes with cooldown reduction. The other stats aren't great, but not too bad. When it comes to your amulet, you want to use Storm Soul here because it's a higher percentage than something like Conceited. It doesn't have as high of uptime against elites, which is kind of the only downside because sometimes your pet may be jerking it in Africa, so the elite might not be vulnerable. But you have Ice Blades, you have Frost Nova, and on bosses is where you really need the damage, and you'll permanently have this on bosses. It's really good to have a generic thing on your amulet because it's going to scale all of your damage, your Firewall, your X-Falls, and your Meteor. On the gloves, I go for Conceited, just generic damage. You could also put this on the amulet if you just wanted a little bit more uptime on the biggest damage increase possible. On the weapon here, I have Ice Blades, has a higher chance to apply vulnerable, and you just straight up gain 25% increased vulnerable damage. With this legendary by itself, Ice Blades will have permanent vulnerable uptime on bosses, so you never have to worry about vulnerable on single targets pretty much ever again. The last legendary that I have is a Meteor specific one. It's the only one that I'm going for that is specific to one skill, and it's because it makes Meteor apply burn, which is really good, and it just drastically increases the amount of damage Meteor is going to do, so it's definitely worth putting on. I see some people using Aspect of Control with the build, but like I've said 1,000 times, your problem with the build is not your clear speed, it is your boss damage, and this is not going to help your boss damage. When it comes to what you want on each piece of gear, if you don't have a raiment or you just want more survivability, you would just go for like max HP, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from burning. That would be very good, and you could get the Aspect of Everliving, I think it's called. It just reduced damage against vulnerable or crowd-controlled enemies. On your gloves, these are pretty bad. What you want is attack speed, crit chance, because crit chance will work for X-Falls and your Meteor, lucky hit chance, and then for the fourth one, it's not as important. You could get intelligence or lucky hit chance to restore resource, but resource should never be a problem for you, so I would prefer to just go intelligence for flat damage. On the pants, you want ranks to Meteor and ranks to Firewall, total armor percent on at least one piece of gear, and then probably max HP, damage reduction from close, something like that. I forgot to mention it, but you do want the Juggernaut aspect. If you have a good roll of this, you can get it up to like almost 6,000 armor. By itself, that will armor cap you if you have total armor percent on the pants as well or on the chest. That will by itself armor cap you. In T100s, you only need 13,000 armor, but unless you're doing T100s, this by itself will just armor cap you. On the boots, if you're not using Esus, you just go for movement speed, mana cost reduction, intelligence, damage reduction after killing an elite, something like that. Movement speed after killing an elite is pretty nice too. Or sorry, damage reduction while injured is what I meant to say. On your one-hander, you want a wand because it has lucky hit chance. Alternatively, a dagger is fine as well. You want int and all stats. Those are the two most important things. Outside of that, the other stats aren't as important. You could get mastery skill damage, damage to burning, vulnerable damage, or crit damage. Crit damage isn't too bad because it scales up your burning instinct, and it does work for X-Falls and your Meteor, but you don't have very high crit chance, so it isn't a great stat. On your offhand, you want to have a focus for cooldown reduction. You want all stats, intelligence, crit chance, cooldown reduction. Instead of the all stats, you could get mana cost reduction, but it really, mana isn't a problem, guys. Like, I see people focusing way too much on mana. Firewall is, you just don't have a mana problem if you have resource support. It's like very free. For both your rings, you want Talrasha and X-Falls, but until you can get one of those, focus on getting crit chance, damage to close maybe, max HP, crit damage is okay, stuff like that. And then on the amulet, the amulet's pretty interesting. The main thing you want is ranks to mastery skills. Otherwise, you can get all sorts of stuff. Movement speed is very nice. You can get a ton of different damage reduction oriented things. The only damage power you could get that would benefit both Firewall and Meteor and X-Falls would be Inner Flames. Well, this doesn't actually affect X-Falls, but I just have Devouring Blaze because I want to play a full Meteor variation, and Devouring Blaze works very, very well with X-Falls, and it's just a lot of extra damage. But getting cooldown reduction is really, really strong, damage reduction from close, etc. It's kind of just whatever you're able to get. I would just, at the very least, make sure to get ranks to mastery skills and movement speed. Intelligence is actually a lot of extra damage. You can see I get 11% int. I just dropped this here. 11% int makes me go from 943 to 1046, and you can see my attack power changes pretty drastically there because int is just skill damage. So I go from 104% skill damage down to 94%. So it's literally 10% damage just from the intelligence there, which is pretty decent. And more intelligence scales the Paragon Board node, not Searing Heat. Where is it? Burning Instinct. This Paragon board is different than what I will have linked in the description, so just check that out, but I'm real quickly just going to mention what I have on the board. Burning Instinct is really good because it just increases your burning damage for your firewall. This is unfortunately not going to scale your meteor, but similarly, Searing Heat is not going to scale your meteor. You're going to lose a little bit of overall damage in order to get both of these, but it isn't a massive investment because the points aren't super out of the way, and you do benefit a good bit. Like 72% increased damage for firewall is really good, and 15% crit, or 12% I guess, and 30% damage. Meteor is pretty good. Outside of that, when it comes to the glyphs, I have Elementalist in the first board for more boss damage, but I believe in the Paragon board that I linked down below, I don't have Elementalist, and that's because I kept Territorial for that version of it, because I like the damage reduction there, and you don't really need the resistance for elements here. You want Adept. Adept is like by far the best thing that you can get early on. Next to that, I have Reinforced because it buffs the non-physical damage here, and it gives damage reduction while you have a barrier, which is really nice. I have Destruction, which is fantastic, just increases the amount of damage that the enemy takes, and getting all this crit damage will scale Burning Instinct and also just increase your damage overall. And lastly, I have the Frigid Fate board with Control. Control is not going to buff your boss damage, so you could opt to swap Control with Territorial, and that would be probably your highest boss damage setup. You could go Flame Feeder, but this isn't going to, the 10% multiplicative isn't going to work for Firewall, but you do get a lot of additive damage that works for Firewall, and the direct damage would work with Meteor and X-Falls. And then next to that, I have Frigid Fate for the additional damage here against vulnerable enemies, and there's just some extra damage in this board. When it comes to playing with the build, it's pretty easy. You want to just be cycling your cooldowns. One thing that I really like to do is I just leave firewalls behind me. I'll teleport into enemies, Frost Nova them, drop a meteor. You could even meteor before you teleport into the mob so that by the time you teleport, the meteor's just dropping on their head and one-shotting them. But I never really stay and fight mobs. I kind of am just constantly running away from them, putting firewalls behind me, teleporting into new mobs, and just rotating my CC chain, and pretty much everything is just dying behind me constantly. And that's pretty much it. The build is pretty tanky. If you're ever feeling like you have a lack of survivability, I would recommend just taking Raiment off. Raiment, as you can see with the teleport stun, is particularly helpful because of the way that you can kind of line up a meteor into a teleport into a Frost Nova to instantly get that vulnerable, and then the whole pack just gets one-shotted. That is a very satisfying combo to do, but otherwise you'd have a higher uptime on your teleport because it wouldn't be as long of a cooldown. You'd get the damage reduction from that almost all the time, and you would take less damage because you have way more damage reduction oriented stuff on your chest. Outside of that though, you can kind of just spam and play the build very mindlessly if you want to. The biggest thing I would recommend is just not like spamming firewalls on top of mobs. I would recommend putting firewalls down and just continuing to run, and then anytime there's a pack of elites, you can just teleport on them, use your Frost Nova there to get the vulnerable instantly, and then spam your meteors on those guys. But if you have a low enough meteor cooldown, you can also just put meteors behind you just like you are the firewalls, and stuff will kind of just die behind you without you really having to worry about it because the damage over time effect of firewall is so strong, and all you really need is just one X-Falls proc, and then everything will kind of just die. The way that I have the build set up right now is I'm missing a bit of survivability, and it is not like perfectly optimized for tier 100s, but I'm going to be optimizing my meteor variation, which I'm going to come out with probably tomorrow or the day after, and that's going to be perfectly optimized for tier 100s. The main reason for this build is just get you guys up to 100 and kind of, again, like I was saying, a stepping stone build so you can easily swap from firewall and meteor over to a full meteor variation. Hopefully you guys enjoyed and found it helpful. If you did, please be sure to drop a like, all that stuff, and I will see you guys later. Peace.